Record. Okay. We already started doing this, but just go around and check in on how people are doing with classes and whatnot. As I was describing to folks who had gotten here a little early, I'm joining you from a hotel room in Richmond, Virginia right now because large swaths of our fair population are still without electricity. As I understand it, there's electricity at my house now. I'll know in a couple hours, but sort of in emergency retreat mode right now. But nothing stops Palm Journal Club, so here we are with that. And so Katie and Sue can tell us about the Minnesota temperatures now. Katie, you go first.
Oh, Sue and I were just comparing notes because she's up in Duluth, which is by Lake Superior, so it stays warmer.
I'm in Twin Cities.
Oh, you're back in the Twin Cities?
Mike is down in Duluth, yeah.
Yeah, so
I was up in Duluth, so I've got the best of both worlds because I was coming from Duluth where it was -20 and I get here in time for an ice storm, so I've had the most of this winter.
Yes. Really the big problem with the cold is mostly for me is with my children. They don't go outside for recess. And so then they're just these little balls of energy. So my house is circular in that we have a bunch of stuff in the middle, then you can go around the outside really. And so we'll make them do laps. 20 laps, go.
That's awesome.
That's the kind of parent I am.
And they have the day off they have the day off anyway for President's Day, right?
They do it. Yeah, they're home right now. They're 6 and 8. So I was like, just don't yell for the next hour. That'd be great. But no promises. We've just gotten into Harry Potter. Well, I say just, we're like book 4. But so they'll do like wand battles and it's very loud. So no promises there. Things are, I don't teach traditionally right now, right? I'm working with professionals in the biopharmaceutical industry right now, so they're not your typical students. I'm doing my very first, you guys are going to all roll your eyes at this statement, but I'm doing my very first all online session.
Oh, good for you.
Because we've been able to do it in really small groups, so just like 10 at a time. So we've been able to manage it in person mostly, but they have a lot of people working from home right now, obviously. And so we did an all online version. And I will say that I was a little nervous at first, but it's been fine, except that I feel like it feels less real to them in terms of actually doing their work on time. And so there was a person that I was like, we're 75% of the way done with this course and you haven't turned anything in. So I don't, he was coming to the classes, but he wasn't doing anything. So is that I'm assuming that's sort of been a common experience for people that maybe the reality of the online course is decreased when it's all online. I don't know. But
to some extent that it doesn't feel like a real class. And that you're right that I think we dealt with that a little earlier in the pandemic for a lot of us, but you're absolutely right that it's sort of been a common experience.
Yeah. Well, these are full-grown adults, so with fully
that would be the difference.
Frontal cortexes. So I'm just like, here's the reality. Make your choices.
Yeah, exactly. Sue, let's have you check in next.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm also doing irregular kind of teaching this semester. It's professional development for faculty on student wellness, and they're very eager. They're not students, they're participants. They're very eager to speak up and share things, but they don't want to do any pre-session readings or anything. So in that way, they're very much like students.
Alonzo, how are you doing?
Yeah, it's going quite well. I think I really have settled into the full remote hybrid stuff. I got a bit of full remote lecturing going on, and then I've got our intro neuro labs or hybrid touch points. So I've got my TAs doing some in-person opportunities with the students, and that all seems to be balancing out and logistically working, because that's the nightmare, right? If something happens, it's 30 minutes to get to campus. So trying to make all that work, but we seem to be going well. And Actually, we team teach a lot of classes. So for the first class I'm teaching this semester, I'm just about done with my unit, and then I'll be swapping over. I'll have a bit of a break, and I'll swap over to a different class for the end of the semester. So that is a welcome welcome break in a few weeks. And we don't have a snowstorm, so doing pretty good. Yeah.
All things considered, yeah. And you said, I'm sorry, you were completely online or partially online?
So everything that I'm doing is like my contributions are remote, but my TAs were eager to do some in-person stuff for the lab, and so I've set up some. I have gone in person to help them set up the in-person labs for the students when they come in.
I gotcha. Okay. And then Melanie has joined us. Melanie, how are you doing?
Hi, everyone. Everything's going okay. I am all remote this spring semester. I have 3 different preps, so I'm feeling a little bit in the weeds right now, trying to keep up with everything. And I have the exact schedule I had last spring, so it's really hard for me to kind of wrap my brain around the fact that we're approaching that 1 year mark since the pandemic hit. So everything's okay. I just trying to, keep my head above water at this point.
It's a good plan. I'm going to ask you guys if you can have the paper open on your computers, because I am doing this from my phone today, and my what do you call it? The PDF is on my laptop screen, which is just a few feet from me, but for the sake of convenience, you don't really need it in front of our screen shared to have a good conversation about it. And this is the second session that we have had talking about this paper. And in fact, Anjali is joining us here. She was on our first conversation, so she can maybe offer some perspective on that as well. We had a really fun time, I think, talking about this the other day with a slightly larger group of people about sort of our conceptions of think, pair, share, pro and con, and some of the reasons why we might want to reconsider the notion of how the sharing portion of think, pair, share actually works. And they lead off this paper with 3 distinct scenarios, a couple of which I actually felt myself relating to from my own life, not as a professor, but as a student. The random call panic, absolutely. And I wasn't even in a 300-person class, but I certainly remember the notion of having to, out of nowhere, answer a question or share what I felt, something like that. Not even because I was somehow afraid I didn't know an answer, but more because I wasn't necessarily ready to volunteer that level of information, maybe even about myself and my beliefs, to a larger group of people. And then grad school me related to the current culture of science seminars, the thought of maybe having a question to ask, but being afraid of the question being stupid to the people around me, and not necessarily being able to engage in active participation in that kind of scientific discussion. And so that leads nicely to what is in table 1, which is basically just a review or a quick reminder of what we mean by think, pair, share. The idea of having people take some time to consider their ideas about whatever the subject matter is, giving people a chance to talk about it in some kind of small group setting, and then sharing out those ideas to the larger group. In principle, it's a great plan, right? Give everyone a chance to actually discuss through potential ideas, maybe assimilate a variety of different ideas from a group of students. What this paper wants us to think about is maybe our assumptions. Actions could be dangerous is a strong word, but counterproductive to some of the things we're trying to do in a class, especially with equity for all of our students in mind. And so I would direct your attention to table 2, the 6 assumptions that the authors want us to think about in terms of the benefits of think, pair, share, and how our assumptions might not be all that they seem. And so I think what I'd like to do as sort of a starting point for our conversation is to look at those 6 assumptions and see if there are certain ones there that maybe speak to you as being especially relevant to your classroom experiences. So if you take a look at that.
I mean, for me, assumption one is probably the assumption I was making, right? That
And just to share that out,
for the share portion, right? Is
the share is an effective way for me to figure out what students are thinking so I can adjust to their needs.
Yes. And I would say with probably a side of assumption 4, right? A little
motivate students
to probably a mixture of those two is probably, I would say, is where I was sitting in sort of the think, pair, share movement there, because I typically have mine in groups of 4 or 5. And so in terms of hearing from multiple students, it's more than just a pair typically for me. So for me, it would be 1 and 4 is where I was sitting.
So actually, that brings up an interesting question to ask. If you have a larger, I mean, not pairs, but groups of 4 or 5, are there ever concerns about particular people in a group not participating in the pairing, shall we say, the discussion part of those activities? And if there is, are there ways that you have found to get around that?
I have said before that if somebody would do a week-long in-person training session on how to better manage group dynamics, in a science class, I want to be specific. In a science class, I am all in on that.
Yeah.
It's not that I'm not attempting to manage group dynamics, but I don't know that I've really feel like I'm hitting the nail on the head.
I feel the same way. Yeah, I feel the same way. And these assumptions also lead to, despite efforts I've made to try to get equity in people participating, things like that, that it's very hard to get around those small subset of people that want to always talk, right? That always want to get their points across. Sometimes, not usually with bad intentions, but if left completely unregulated, it's very easy for a couple of people to dominate an entire class, which can take away from that point of sharing if only a few people's views are getting out there.
Kimberly Tanner has an interesting trick for dealing with that. I've seen her use it, and I've employed it after seeing her do it. And that is, she will either say specifically, I need to hear from someone who has not yet spoken. If you've spoken before, you're out of the pool here. Or dealing with the one about whether or not grad students get a chance to talk at seminars and things. And this was done at the Gordon Research Conference a couple of years ago. They would announce before the person gave a presentation, and so you could do this before the think, pair, share, who exactly are you willing to hear from? And so only grad students can ask questions. Only postdocs could ask questions in some sessions.
That's neat.
And if they didn't have any questions, then it could go to other people. But being more specific about who you want to hear from. No, it's helpful.
I also like the multiple hands ones where you're not going to invite anyone to share until you see at least 3 or 4 or however many hands up, and then you get to choose, right? So you can try and choose more equitably or from somebody who hasn't spoken yet. That's definitely been one that's worked well for me. But it doesn't really address the in-group, right? When you have groups of 4 or 5. I think groups of 3 are really nice for that reason. It's harder to be that one person being quiet in a group of 3, but just the way my classroom was set up, groups of 3 wasn't going to work. So.
Yeah, I actually like those ideas, Sue, better I know there's other examples I've read about where everyone gets cards or chips or something like that. Cash them in, you can't talk anymore. That's a more direct, like, okay, I'd like to hear from somebody else, get your point across and manage things probably a little better, a little bit more deliberately. So I definitely like that idea. But it's interesting because it speaks to, again, assumptions about think, pair, share, and what we think could be working well and what maybe could benefit from some adjustment in terms of making sure everyone's getting a chance to talk, making sure there are not issues in equity to be considered. And then it's interesting, assumption number 2 happens to be randomly calling on students during the share decreases equity issues in whole group discussion. Or in fact, you could inadvertently be exacerbating some of those issues simply by trying to foster communication in the class period, or whoever might randomly be in a conversation. In our last session, we actually talked about POGIL a little bit because we had some POGIL people there. And the interesting thing with POGIL was that the groups had designated recorders, reporters, things like that you could rotate the job around. And that could maybe potentially help in that situation where somebody knew going in, they would be the people talking. Sue, you look like you had a
Well,
comment.
team-based learning does that also.
Yeah.
If you adhere to it kind of strictly. I was going to say that assumption 1, or most of these, they assume that share means talking about it. And there are lots of other ways to share.
Right.
And so the paper does bring this up, that sharing in a Google Doc or sharing on cards and having those collected at the end of the session. I do agree that what people say in the share often does not reflect the richness of what was said. I mean, that happens with groups that I participate in on, breakout rooms, and we have this magnificent discussion. And then when it comes time to tell the group, whoever's reporting for a group takes the one least interesting thing usually to mention because it's easy. So I think just getting away from thinking that sharing has to all be verbal. And I find in breakout sessions online, people are much more willing to put things in chat. Now, mind you, that's not anonymous, but
that's an interesting, almost psychological thing to it, that people maybe feel somewhat better that they're not in a situation where everybody has stopped and is staring at them and they're orally saying something. Like the act of almost semi-asynchronously, if that's even a term, writing something down for everyone to consider on their own maybe is a little bit better way of doing this, and for many.
I just want to say something about POGIL and team-based learning. So I used
Yes.
POGIL a lot for the past, not lately, but before. In my current institution, I was at Florida. And my experience was the same. Like, even if you assign the role to the people, like you're going to be a reporter, it's like active learning. It's a work in progress, and it takes a lot of time to really get that engagement from the students, even if you assign the roles. So, and even in our, if you look at our journal club, right, or any other journal club we go as a graduate student, not everybody was participating at the same level. So I really don't understand how to, or maybe I'm not defining it well, is how to as an instructor, how to work on this. What is the best way? Is just to keep working at it and then see how it comes along, or
Anjali,
Well, so go ahead, Katie.
oh, I was gonna say, when do you mean, I'm sorry, I might have missed something in there, but when you mean work at it, are you talking about like the active learning component and having your students actually engaging, like talking to each other? Is that what you're?
yeah, like all aspects of it. Like, A group work typically for me worked out well, but the reporting part, or maybe like reassigning the role to people so that we can achieve that equity, like everybody gets a chance to become a reporter and a recorder. So holding them accountable. So I personally believe there are several aspects to it, not just one. But yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, because there's one thing to assign somebody that they're going to be a reporter. All that does is, give them a heads up. Giving them a heads up might not necessarily um, mitigate right whatever problem you may have with somebody, not necessarily, which brings you back to what Sue suggested, that maybe a written version of this, or as the paper is going to talk about here, an asynchronous version of this may potentially work better for your particular situation.
Yeah,
Okay.
I really liked how the paper pointed out issues and sort of analyzed the issues from multiple perspectives, but then also provided solutions, or suggestions for things to try. And I was like, I was all in for that.
Yeah, it doesn't always give potential remedies. It's always nice to have that idea. What I liked about this particular table, though, with the assumptions and the challenges, was it did, the point is to be thought-provoking, and absolutely that mission was accomplished, and me, not having thought about some of these issues as being potentially serious or even being issues until seeing them written out like this. So I appreciated that aspect of things. And so that would take us then over to table 3, which would be the actual descriptions of these potential alternatives, from the simple small modification to the extreme of actually eliminating the share outright. So a lot of this is going to be obviously dependent on your particular situation, the particular goals that you have for a particular class, things like that. But there are several options here designed to try to make the share a more equitable experience and as comfortable an experience for all your students as possible. And so I think some of these things are very simple, but also potentially very powerful. I'm looking at the optional consent to share, and I'm also looking at assigning of competence in the middle there. That's something that I had tried to do before, so I was glad to see it on here. The idea of simply maybe expressing an idea that you heard in the shares going on in a class that wasn't necessarily going to get out there into the whole discussion, but to take that opportunity for you yourself to say, oh, so-and-so had this idea, and so it acknowledged the good contributions that person made to the discussion without forcing them to be the person who actually had to do the talking. So I appreciated sort of that subtle but powerful tweak you could make there to actually, what's the term you use, Sue? Richness, improve the richness of the overall conversation that you're getting.
I think one thing that is also possible is combining 2 of these, which is the optional consent to share and assigning competence. It's easy to get the consent to share in an active learning classroom if you really are moving among groups. And I've been known to go to a group and say, oh, that's a really interesting point that you just brought up. And I haven't heard anybody else talking about that. Would you be willing to bring that up to the whole class when we come to sharing? And if the person doesn't feel comfortable, then I say, well, do you mind if I share it? So there's a way to kind of get the best of both worlds. If the student does feel good that I just praised him or her for having a great idea, they might feel more confidence in saying it to the group. But if they still don't, I can say, well, I can keep it anonymous. You can say, I heard this great idea when I was walking around the room, and what do you guys think of this?
Can't help but think about my experiences with the remote sections right now as we go through this, and how I see myself going back and forth, like Sue was saying, with multiple options. You know, like sure, you assign a reporter, but then sometimes, you know, maybe it's best if it's a more complicated thing and we're online, everything's being recorded, to just explain it for the students rather than to put them on the spot, because you recognize that maybe something where they're getting tripped up. And so I look at this and I go, yeah, these are all great, but you know, my experience this semester, last semester, is really with the environment that we're in now, being flexible in terms of, you know, having multiple of these strategies at your disposal depending on situation. For example, today we did clickers, and I usually ask the students to contribute after their clickers why they chose. And I tried everything from the hand raise button in Zoom, and that worked for like 2 or 3 of the 10 questions. Then people stopped raising their hand, and I got the same 2 or 3 students. And you just have to bounce around. So then I was like, okay, well, you know, let me explain one and then pick on someone. So I don't know. It's just my opinion on that.
I've tried to use the raise hand thing in classes or sometimes in seminars, and I find most of the now, granted, these usually aren't students, these are usually colleagues in a certain situation. They can't locate the raise hand button. And so it ends up not being able to work. But that's another maybe just Zoom universe question and not more of a larger issue. I like that idea, sort of, Sue, that those do go hand in hand, of the optional consent and the assigning competence, being able to capture some of those things that would not necessarily be captured. In part of that real-time synthesis, it also talks about the listening in aspects to things. So I'd actually be curious to hear if people have particular strategies to how they go around and try to capture ideas from particular small groups. Sometimes I feel almost weird sort of sidling up to people and listening in as they are having their discussions. And so are there particular approaches people take to that listening in process that makes it work maybe more effectively in your particular classes?
Mike, I just wanted to say one thing that you brought up. In a face-to-face class, I have no problem going around, kind of listening in and, you know, standing there and watching them and giving my input and getting feedback. But I find it to be very intrusive to sit in their breakout room and be like a voyeur almost. Like I don't know why, I just feel very uncomfortable, and I feel like I have to make myself do it. And the very first semester where I had breakout rooms, and I almost did not go into the room, but I found that I really had to kind of make sure that everyone was participating and on task. So face to face, I have no problem, you know, interacting, walking around, sitting down. But I just find it to be very intrusive online, especially when they're all kind of with their cameras off and I'm just standing there in their room. But I think it's an interesting point.
Yeah, I totally agree.
You're not alone in that.
Yeah. I will say, I said at the beginning, I'm doing this, you know, weird year here. I'm doing a lot of professional development training for like adults. But I had heard from somebody in my department that they'll have students working on Google Docs, right? And so they'll just keep an eye, and like when there's a group that's, you know, not being productive or going the wrong direction, then she'll pop into their group to sort of move things forward in a positive way. But otherwise, it kind of stays out of it. Yeah, I agree. It makes me really weird and uncomfortable too.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to share one thing that what I did was I assigned a paper to read, and what I gave 5 points for reading and the remaining 5 for discussion. And it forced students to talk in the Zoom room, in the classroom. So everybody was accountable for their grade. So again, it goes back to, you know, when students have an incentive, they would like to talk, but if they don't, and they're just sitting there. And that's what happens oftentimes in the group work. That, okay, what am I getting out of it? Okay, one person can take the lead, and I can be on the side burner. So.
I'll follow up on this discussion about the breakout rooms. I think totally by accident last semester when I'd set up my Zoom reuse Blue Jeans, those sessions to auto record, it auto recorded what occurred in the breakout rooms as well. And so I found myself for like my labs and class breakout rooms where I wasn't able to get in, checking occasionally just to see was there good discussion. And most of the time, 90% of the time there was good discussion. And then additionally, this semester even, when I do longer 10, 15 minutes assignments where we can get into the different breakout rooms, I tell the students we're going to come around, and I don't have any awkward feelings about when I come in. I feel like, either they need my help and they're glad to see me, or they don't need my help and I just say hi and, then I go on my way. So maybe it's not as awkward as it can be. I feel more awkward when I'm looming over them in the classroom, and then I do like sneaking into their Blue Jeans room. So what that's worth.
Yeah. And maybe if you like prep, I've heard also like instructors will jump in like with muted and with their video off, and they'll just tell people like, I'm going to come in, I'm just going to be an observer, and then I'm going to go out after a couple minutes. So like, ignore me. Don't stop talking just because I'm here. So I've heard that too. One of the things I was thinking about,
that actually contributes to a lot of things we talk about with active learning in general, that if you describe your intent, you describe what you're doing and why you're doing it, that actually can make your students buy into a lot of the stuff a lot more. And that's just a general comment we've made the whole time. So that's actually, I think, a good observation you make there, that if you do that and you are upfront about, okay, this is what we're doing, or this is what I'm going to be doing, this is why I'm doing it, that I think you can achieve that, right? That you would allow the conversation to continue despite the fact you're going in or out. So I think that's a good point.
I have to say,
what were you going to say, Katie? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was in the vein of Sue talking about bringing multiple alternatives together. I was really sort of inspired by the, and I haven't done it, so, but I was inspired by the index cards and the electronic posts, because I was looking at that and I was thinking, like, you could put a lot of stuff together there. One, you would be, if you do it outside of the classroom, then that would allow you to have, I just lost my thought, to spend less time in the class doing it. So you get some of that time back. Plus, it would incorporate like writing to learn, right? So if you had people talking in groups and then outside of the class, they had to write their own response, that would be writing to learn. And if you were doing it outside of class, you'd be using recall, right? So they'd have to be recalling information after some amount of time had passed. And then you would also still be able to do assigning competence if you wanted, right? So you could curate a sample of student responses, right? And which would allow you to, maybe email those people and say, hey, I thought this was really great. Do you mind if I include it in my sort of sample of great responses or something like that? So you could like mix a number of things together. I felt like using that.
Yeah, I know when we were face to face, I would use index cards for like the muddiest point, where they could write something down.
I think it's a good idea. I think as you're describing.
Sorry. Michael's internet is sketchy.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry if I interrupted you.
Wow. Okay, I didn't realize time delay was that bad. So I was just saying that one of the things that you would need to think about in that situation, or I'd be curious to, as you describe writing to learn, how you would assess the posting. I think it's a good idea. I think you'd want to make sure that your students felt comfortable to write, maybe not necessarily casually, but knew that they weren't necessarily going to be judged on rhetoric or something like that in those posts. So as long as you accounted for that, I think you'd be in really good shape. That was just my only concern about that. Otherwise, I think it's a good strategy.
I was just going to make maybe one other point about the table for alternate choices with think, pair, shares. I use a lot of clicker time, so I use Turning Point. And one strategy is to ask a question to the whole class, and then have them talk about the answer to that question. Don't reveal the answer. Have them then work together in groups to talk about that question, and then poll the class again, and then reveal the answer. So I've tried doing this remotely, where I have students in teams, but they're all remote, so they really can't. I don't put them into like breakout rooms to talk about the question, right? They're just like competing, like it's kind of gamified. So they're working together in teams, but I poll the class first. I don't reveal the answer, and then do it one more time. So I think that, to me, sometimes that's a good strategy, because it's anonymous with their clickers, so they can answer whatever they like. They can change their answer, but then to see how the answers change once everyone is together in their groups, I think is powerful.
That makes me think about one of the points in the article where they were saying the few students in the group that control the conversation. And I definitely see that whenever you do those, okay, now talk to your partner and see if your answer changes. You can see someone is usually more dominant, but I guess I'm a bit conflicted, because what if that person is the person who's normally right? Like, does it depend on the level of question that we're talking about, whether it's a higher level thought or it's more factual, where you need that? But if the person's right, they're right. Like, how do you go against that? I don't know.
I don't know, maybe you could try spitballing here again, never tried it, but maybe you could try prompting them with other, like, instead of saying just share and somebody says, well, I had A and I had B, it's also the discussion of well, why did you pick B? And then maybe the partner can say, oh, well, here's sort of what you're missing from that reasoning, or where maybe you got something incorrect. But again, I think that does take a fair amount of comfort, as well as just, that's teaching, right? And that's a complex process. So I don't know. That probably wasn't a great answer.
Well, it gets back to our reservations about group dynamic too, that what are the ways that you want to put people together, in terms of, I think it's Alonzo describes it, the people that tend to be right about things, or people that tend to have more difficulty. I think that's part and parcel to that issue. And we've already alluded, Katie and myself, that like we've had our own sort of concerns about how to effectively put that together.
Tanya, Sue, if you're looking to write another grant.
Yeah. Solve one problem, solve the other.
How to teach science faculty how to manage group dynamics in the classroom.
Yeah, you can sign me up for that one.
Yeah. And people have done this. I mean, it's not like nobody's ever thought of this before, of course, but it's interesting that these ideas of getting effective groups together in the first place would absolutely influence the effectiveness of your sharing and the effectiveness of getting a good amount of conversation out. So, I would also say something I've tried in my own classes is having the actual sharing component go on, and then having the groups actually share the highlights of their discussion on the board. So everybody has to come up and write down things for the whole class to see, which I guess is just another take on. It's not really asynchronous because it's happening in real time, but it's also getting people to write their ideas down for the whole class to see. And then each group has to go around and talk about what it is they wrote. And so you're combining sort of a best of both worlds. And if you actually had a secretary of sorts that was doing the consolidation of ideas and somebody else who was designated a reporter, a talker, that could be another opportunity to spread around the wealth, if you will, in terms of people contributing to particular discussions. So I think that's just another variation of modifying what's being done here to get a few more ideas out into the open, making sure you're capturing as much of the variety of the discussion as you can. Now, something like that's not going to work that well for if you're just doing a definitive, okay, what are the facts of this situation? It's more of a discussion based, how do you feel about this particular thing? How would you react to this particular thing type of question. So it's question dependent, but sometimes it could be effective.
This conversation is reminding me of.
There's also the notion of just, go ahead, Sue.
Oh, Diane Ebert May taught me a trick years ago about teaching evolution. And so for those of you who teach the same course multiple times and you know that there are particularly tricky things that students struggle with, she had these statements that students had made about evolution, about a particular scenario, and she asked them to describe it. And then she had about 6 or 7 versions of things that were close, but no cigar. There were some true statements that students made and some misconceptions represented. And you would introduce this by saying, these are not your comments. These are from a previous class, or this is from some other institution, and this is what students have said about this scenario. And in a group, I'd like you to look at what's right and what's wrong. How would you defend what's here? And sometimes that makes it anonymous enough. They're not defending their own statements. You can get kind of defensive if you just blurted out something that everyone else says is not true. But looking
they'll also get more critical. I find whenever I give students, like, these are students that are not in this class, like their work, they'll just shred it. And so if you're worried about sort of the misconceptions being sort of parlayed by having student responses, you could do these are not, like you said, they were not quite right. Can you find the parts that are inaccurate and fix them? And students would probably, I would imagine, would just go to town.
Mm-hmm.
So then in that scenario, the inequity issue doesn't arise. So when you have more freedom and you're not, I don't know. So I'm just trying to get the point was my original point that I want to mention was that the main crux of the Think, Pair, Share paper that we are discussing is that it is the inequities, and the Think, Pair, Share cultivates more inequities, and maybe students are not prepared enough. But if you think beyond other reasons, there could be other reasons. People are not well prepared for the class. People are shy to talk in the groups, and so isn't it there is more barriers than to individual themselves than the inequities? Is that correct?
Yes. I agree.
I was just thinking, and maybe this isn't directly related to that statement. I was just thinking how I have done Think, Pair, Share in the past in my classroom is I would say talk to a neighbor. Like they weren't in defined groups. So it was like, talk to a neighbor, or if you just want to talk to yourself, right? So I didn't want to put anyone under like undue stress that they had to find someone to talk to. And so I kind of left it a little bit more open-ended. And so again, I don't know if that's like the proper way to do think, pair, share, but that was kind of the way that I could get my students talking. I'm at a community college. They are commuters. They don't often, maybe meet outside of class time. So it was just a way for me to get students talking. And I would usually use a question like, why are cells small, in a biology classroom. So I think I used it more as just to have students talk to one another and interact. And if they didn't want to, I didn't make them. That's how I used it in the past. But anyway, I don't know if that directly answers your question.
And also the think, pair, share is one form of active learning, correct? Or one form of formative assessment. There could be different forms of assessment that could have similar issues or similar barriers that student might encounter. So,
Yeah, I agree. I find like, I don't know if I use think, pair, share enough to have thought about it this deeply. It's nice that there's this article, but I may do 2 or 3 over the course of the semester, specifically think, pair, shares. It seems like this is more for those who use it more regularly, maybe, where you can actually start to create inequity by routinely having this as the one form of activity in the course. I don't know.
And that may be a good take-home message for this in general, that this is one of many different techniques that one can use in a particular class to foster active learning. And so this is a good discussion to think about how this effectively works in your situation, in your particular classes versus maybe somebody else's. And if you find that you have, for instance, issues with people dominating discussions, things like that, or if there are other ways you frankly just feel more comfortable with doing this, then you should tweak around, right? You should look at these other techniques we're talking about as well. And maybe this consideration of think, pair, share leads you to say, okay, it works in some of my classes, but in others, I think I'm going to go a different direction. And if that's as useful a conclusion to draw from this as anything else.
Yeah, and I would like to sort of pivot the equity discussion into the last point, which talks about our science seminars. And that one also, I mean, obviously I'm very focused on my own teaching choices, but that one also really spoke to me too. I mean, we've all sat through so many science seminars, and just that it's like, that's not a good way to do it. Why are we still doing it that way? There's so many problems that they brought up here, especially related to equity and so on. And that one really spoke to me. And it was really sort of thinking about like, well, how can we ask questions in a better way to hear from more voices, and also to stop some people from just commenting on their own work and not really asking a question.
That's one thing I do like about online seminars and having someone monitoring the chat, because someone can deliberately have the mentality of, I'm not going to choose one of these, someone who's just tooting their own horn. I'm going to find a real question and maybe specifically look for the students who are asking questions here.
Well, it's a lot harder to, not actually ask a question and just comment on your own work when you're typing it. But I get that had me thinking of like, it would be interesting to do sort of the think and the pair at the end of a seminar. And I have actually gone to a handful that have done something like that, where they ask you to stop and talk to your neighbor at the end.
Mhm.
And then but then maintaining, once we go back to doing stuff in person, like submitting a question into some sort of online forum, but that way where you could hear from multiple people and you could have like the host of the guest speaker curate some answer or questions or something like that. Be interesting. I don't know.
And I think a lot of this is this, issues for everything, that if it's quote unquote the way it's always been done, that there's always going to be hesitation to change or overcome inertia. And so these ideas, I've been struck, and you just brought it up, the last couple of years. I know the ASCB Education Committee has been deliberate about this, of having active components to their seminars. Of if you're going to a presentation there, you're not going to just simply get to be an idle participant. They expect you to participate in some kind of discussions with your neighbors, discussions with the group in general. And so as time goes on, I could see that becoming more prominent, or more, maybe not prominent, but more likely to be found in a given time to time. I like that Gordon conference idea, by the way, that maybe it can be, okay, no one gets to ask questions until we're sure that our grad student population gets to ask their questions, like sort of a gradation there. It could be a really useful way to encourage more participation or more equity in participation.
Yeah, I like our biology teaching and learning department. We've been doing you have the seminar, and then the next day we have these like 30-minute slots you sign up for, and they were reserving like a 30-minute slot with the speaker for only grad students, and that way they definitely get their share of talking to the speaker. And I thought that I was like, well, that's a great idea.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it would take like convincing a department chair to institute this as part of, your group's seminars or something like that. It would take somebody in a position of power to create, I think, that change. But it's also not that hard. Like, it's really not that big of a change, right? Like, so it seems like something that is feasible. Maybe I'm pie in the sky.
Having the right people in those positions where they can enact change is what's obviously critical there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, final thoughts about this paper.
I was just going to say, I like this page. I'm sorry, Mike, I keep interrupting you. I apologize. I was just going to say, I like this paper. I like the structure of the paper. And I thought that it had a lot to offer and a lot to think about. So I think it was an excellent choice for our journal club.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm on like time delay from everyone. I apologize for that. But I think reiterating too, sort of what Anjali's been getting at, I think Alon suggested this too. This gives you a chance, I think, to evaluate think, pair, share as a technique in general too. Not necessarily philosophically about is it good, is it bad, but is it something that works for you? Is it something that is appropriate in your situation with your particular constituency? And if it's not the only way in the world to do active learning. And would be good to consider as well. They broach the subject in this paper of, let's just simply skip the share. That could be appropriate for you as well. Just get people to have the conversations and move on. So it's a repeated thing that you need to do what's best for your own particular situation. And so, again, that's as good a take-home message as any to get out of this particular discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you have to make that decision every academic term. I find a section of a class can be so different from one another.
Yeah, like Alonzo pointed out, right? It's just another tool in the toolkit, right? And the more options you have, the better able you are to respond semester, or but also just in the moment, right? So.
Thank you guys.
They're good.
That is
And
one
we will have
ugly
one more
mascot,
discussion of
Michael.
this paper later.
That's the mascot?
So
what is that?
So that's a fun. I didn't realize my thing came up. That's a funny story, and I went to several different presentations where the University of Wisconsin had Bucky the Badger with a lab coat and a flask in his hand. And so I came back to my students and said, "Gentlemen, make me a mascot." And so we got this adorable fat tiger with a lab coat on. And so I object to ugly. I think he is adorable, and he is our he's not endorsed by the college. He is our unofficial in our so we will have one more discussion of this paper later this week. And yeah, any other announcements too, just for the group in general?
Don't think so.
I would reiterate, go ahead, Anjali.
Oh, Anjali wanted to talk to me after the meeting, so I don't know if you want to make one of us host.
Yeah, I'll make you host.
Okay, thanks.
I would reiterate, we have put that Google Doc out for people to share their ideas about additional things the POM network can and maybe should be doing. And some people have responded to that. If you've not taken the opportunity to go and check that out, I would absolutely encourage you to do that. We're also going to tweak that a little bit so it's more obvious, I think, in terms of what, thank you very much, Katie, in terms of that we have money available, that we have resources available that can help you with your particular ideas. So if you have something you think we should be doing, don't be shy. We're definitely looking as we're going forward here about ways to make sure that we're maximizing everybody's opportunities to participate in the network. Okay. And with that, I thank you guys for your participation today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.
Hey, everybody.
Bye.